Alright, so this is going to be a deck tech for Damia Sage of Stone, brought to you by Applesauce Gaming. So to start out, I'm going to go with the basic lands. We've got our forests. There's 5 in the deck, just so that you can always hit the early ramp spells. Next, you're going to have 4 islands. That's just going to be because there's some very heavy blue, and you do have the duels which can cooperate with it, but sometimes it's needed. Next, you're going to have the swamps. You've got 4, making it a total of 13 basics. Next, we have a singleton Scryland, just so that we can control our draw, and because turn 1, 3, and 4, it doesn't really matter if you play it tapped. The same thing is true of Breeding Pool, Overgrown Tomb, and then the Watery Grave, just for some more consistency with the mana. Unfortunately, we don't have the original duels, so we are using the Golgari Guildgate and the Simic Guildgate. There really wasn't a reason to have all 3. And then we also have a Yamivaya Coast and a Hinterland Harbor for mana consistency. Excuse me. We do have the 3 con lands, or the bounce lands, so Dimir Aqueduct, you've got Golgari Rot Farm, and Simic Growth Chamber. They're not very integral on turn 1 or turn 2, but afterwards having a steady supply of 2 mana that you can use is absolutely wonderful. Next, we've got a Tainted Wood for one of our dual lands. It's just another that allows to tap for black or for green if we control a swamp. A little bit low on fetches, we have the Esper Panorama, which fetches 2/3 of the lands in the deck, and a Scalding Tarn in order to get a large amount as well. Next, for utilities, we have Urborg, the Tomb of Yawgmoth, to make everything tap for black as well, because later on there are some heavy black costing spells. We have a Thespian Stage to either make into Command Tower or to make into something that we might need. Dryad Arbor is a solid land to play in EDH. The same of Bojuka Bog in order to completely clear out someone's graveyard, because it's a big strategy in some games. Beseiju, who shelters all, in order to help us with any of our spells that we do not want countered. You pay 2 life and you tap, adding 1, and then any instant or sorcery is uncounterable. Next is Halimar Depths. It's just a ponder that can tap for blue. It does come in tapped, so it's not the best land, but turn 1 or 2, it's still very good. I have a Homeward Path, just because I think that it's actually necessary. I don't know how many people actually play with Control Magic, but it's a decent amount, and I find that it's nice in order to help so that they don't steal the very few creatures that we do run. Next is Reliquary Tower, because this deck relies heavily on drawing, Strip Mine, and Ancient Tomb. Ancient Tomb seems a bit painful, but it actually helps in order to facilitate our mana, and it also helps us cast our X spells for a lot later on down the road. Next is a Temple, as just an additional Ancient Tomb, only it triggers off the 5 lands or more, and that is the total for the lands. Next, we're going to play with a couple of our blue spells. We've got Counterspell, which is just one of our best overall counters. Next, we have Standstill for our card draw section. Standstill is a little bit weird because it reads if any player casts a spell, but it still triggers for us in order to draw 3 cards if an opponent decides to cast something. Next is Jace Beleren. Politically, it's not always a very good card, but it can draw you cards, and it can also help everyone else in the long run. Brainstorm is an additional. As a 1 instant, even though you put back 2 of the cards, the drawing 3 is one of the strongest you can do in early game, and late game it might give you an answer. The same is true of Rhystic Study. It's a very small tax that doesn't do much to hurt the opponent, but does a lot to help you. Additionally, for card draw, we have Phyrexian Arena. You pay 1 life at upkeep, which might seem painful, however you do end up getting quite a bit when you're drawing an additional card each turn. It also reads at upkeep, not at draw step, which is important for Damia, because you are skipping your draw step, meaning that you still end up drawing off of Phyrexian Arena and Damia together. Next is Sylvan Library. Even though you're paying 4 life, if you draw any of the additional cards that you keep, you're still able to filter through as a free ponder every turn. Next, we have some of the ramp spells. The first is going to be Peregrination. Sorry about the Japanese foil. It reads that you take 2 lands. They are basics. 1 comes in tapped, the other goes into your hand. You then scry 1. It was a Japanese foil, I figured I'd put it in just because it's very pretty. I still need to finish a lot of the deck, so some of it's not done. The same is true of Oracle of Moldiah. You play with the top card revealed, you can play an additional land, and if the top card of your deck is a land, you can play it that turn. Next is Yamivaya Elder, or Santa Claus. Yamivaya Elder is great because you get your 2 lands You can also sack it to draw, and then you shuffle afterwards. So it's a nice tutor effect for your land. The same is true of Realm Seekers. Realm Seekers comes in at XX, equal to the number of cards in every player's hand. Late game, it's just a bomb, and it comes in usually 30 or 40 power, if not more. You remove a single counter, and then you get a basic. Even though we only run in the double digits a very low amount of basics, it's still enough to be a relevant effect. The same is true of Harrow. You sacrifice any land, and you get 2 basics. They come in untapped, and it's an instant speed, so the draw is nice. It also filters through some of your deck in order to make sure that you're getting draws that aren't just land. The same thing is true of Nissa's Expedition. It's almost Peregrination, but it's got Convoke, so it's a little bit stronger, though you don't get to scry. You have Kadama's Reach, which is going to be 2 lands that you get. The first is tapped, the other is in your hand. It's good enough that I usually play it. It's not the best, but it ends up helping you quite a bit in the long run. The same is true of Sakura Tribe Elder. What it does is it serves as a chump blocker, and later on you can actually sack it in order to get a land. It comes in tapped still, but it's strong enough that I like playing it. Next is Search for Tomorrow. It's going to be the suspend for 2, but you play it on turn 1, and then you can get a basic, and it comes in... It doesn't come in tapped, which is very nice, so turn 3 you have 4, if not more, mana, and it helps you get ahead of the game, which is one of the things that Damia uses, because it's more of a bug control deck than it is a bug ramp smash face kind of deck. Now, we've got a couple of universal board wipes and other things around us. A utility artifact that helps not so much, but does ramp in the long run, is the Sword of Feast and Famine. The protection from green and black is always relevant. However, the big thing is that you untap all your land. You also discard a card from the person that you hit. So it can kind of put people in a bind, but the biggest thing is making sure that you're always going to be untapping and casting even more spells. Next, for some utilitarian cards, you've got Gaze of Granite. It's kind of the poor man's pernicious deed, but you pay X, 2 black and green, and you board wipe for everything less than X. So it's nice against tokens because you can cast it for 3 and kill an entire board, or if you've got the ramp from Damia, you're able to do a lot in terms of bouncing, or destroying, excuse me. Next is Cryptic Command. The modes for it aren't always relevant, but you can either counter a spell, tap all of the creatures that opponents control, which is sometimes relevant in EDH, especially with different effects on the stack. And in general, the fact that you can draw or return a permanent is great. If you boomerang something that's really hindering your game, it ends up helping you, or if you just stop something that's a complete blowout, it ends up saving you a lot of times. Damnation is just a very good black spell. It's just Wrath of God, but it does stop sometimes, because Regenerate is a thing. It's not always relevant in EDH, but it has its merits. Another not quite board wipe that's still good is Evacuation. The fact that it affects you can be good, because there are Enter the Battlefield triggers in the deck. While it's not the best because it doesn't kill things, it does slow down people, and you usually have enough mana that you're not going to be hurt by it. The same is true of Capsize. It's any permanent, so it's just like Boomerang, only you can pay 3 and you end up buying it back, which is a very strong effect. There's also Putrefy, which hits any artifact or creature, and it can't be regenerated. At the very worst, you end up hitting either a Mana Dork or something small. At the best, you're blowing up somebody's Soul Ring, or you're getting something like an Unwinding Clock, or a very good artifact. The same is true of creatures. Again, the Do Not Regenerate clause isn't the best, but sometimes it's useful. Another great board wipe is Curse of Swine. The fact that it's exile hits a lot of things that are indestructible. That's mostly popular with white. However, there are some creatures that matter outside of that. In general, the fact that they get a 2/2 pig, which is a token, is very easy to deal with, and your creatures don't really have a hard time running over them. Grave Pact is a little bit different. It's sort of an elusive removal spell, and it's a very quasi-board wipe. But every time you lose a creature, everybody else sacrifices one. The fact that it's universal means that you end up doing a lot of damage to people, and the fact that it's sacrificed does a lot against Hexproof, which is relevant at least in my local meta. The same true of Decree of Pain. It's a universal draw spell. It destroys all creatures, and they can't be regenerated just like any of the rats that I use. The best part is the draw, because this deck doesn't run a lot, but the spells that it does are massively effective and just bonkers. Next is Dictate of Erebos. It's similar to Grave Pact. It's a little bit cheaper. It also has Flash. The biggest thing is that having both of them on the board means that they lose 2 for one of your losses, and combining that with the fact that you can make tokens is always great. Late game, it's fine. Early game, it's not as effective. Next is probably one of the best cards in EDH for these colors. It's Prophet of Kufrix. untapping all of your lands and playing creatures at flash is insane. The fact that I don't have to run a Windborn Muse and then a Teferi means I can save slots in whatever I want, and it also just happens to save my life a lot of times. Next is Consuming Aberration. Any spell that's cast mills each opponent, so it is a universal mill. It's an alt win con. The biggest thing is that it's just a bulky creature that helps late game. If I cast a bunch of spells that are cheap or might seem ineffective, I end up getting a bigger creature, and it also gives me more options for things like Rise of the Dark Realms. The best part about the deck in general is that you've got a lot of different things going, and you've got a lot of ways to protect them. The fact that the star equal to graveyard is there doesn't always mean much, but it's an immediate threat when it enters. The same is true of Progenitor Mimic. You don't have to target Consuming Aberration, but it's very relevant if you do. Probably the best target for it is something like Consecrated Sphinx or a Metamorph or anything that they have that you might be able to steal with Control Magic. While it's not always the best, the fact that you get a token each turn means you can also use it with a Ramper, or worst case, you turn it into a Mole Drifter, which is still fine. Speaking of Mole Drifter, it's a 2/2 flyer for 5 that draws you 2 cards. By itself, it's fine, but on turn 3, if you're stuck in a bind and you don't have anything else to do, evoking it and drawing 2 only to cast it later is perfectly acceptable. Palancron is a infinite combo in the deck. It's not always concrete, but the fact that you're untapping 7 in order to pay it for 7 and then returning it for 4 means that you can chain your mana together. Originally, I had Guile with it in order to make infinite mana, and then in order to cast it for free with Nether Void, and Storm for anything that I wanted. Usually it was Temporal Fissure, but I kind of made the deck less mean when I got a little bit tired of people walking away. Phyrexian Metamorph is always a great card. The fact that it's an artifact or a creature means that it triggers on a lot of instances, and it's also Phyrexian mana. So essentially, it costs 3, and you pay 2 life for one of the best artifacts on the board or one of the best creatures on the board. It's a great clone effect, and it's something you should probably run in any blue deck. Another auto-include for blue is Consecrated Sphinx. The fact this runs a lot of card draw, and the fact that you draw off of everyone else, means that your universal effects don't seem as bad, and a lot of times they end up helping you. One of the biggest things with the deck is that it probably won't survive, so you need to make as much maximum value out of it as you can. Similar is Micaias the Unhallowed. It allows for the rampers and all of the small things to be chained together to make them more effective, even though the enter the battlefield effects aren't as strong or aren't as prevalent, and it makes everything have an additional 1/1 counter when it dies. If you're able to remove them, even though it's not really possible in this deck, you can chain through pretty easily. The only example of that is the infinite combo with Triskelion. Assuming they don't have anything to either stifle or cause the effect to stop, it is an infinite loop. You deal 2 damage to Triskelion and 1 to something else. It removes the counters, and then it checks its own damage, having taken 2 for the turn, proving fatal. But because you've removed the counters from Micaias, you get them back. It enters in with an additional counter, and you repeat the effect again and again and again, and you chain through poking somebody to death at instant speed. Similarly is the Soul of Innistrad. While it's not as effective, you play with graveyard strategies, and you're able to return anything from your graveyard to your hand. In this case, it's 3 creatures. Even though we don't run that many, it's still very nice to have that effect. There are a couple creatures that are worth triggering, especially if they happen to die because they're targets. One of them is Psychosis Crawler. The biggest thing is that it's another alt win con, aside from Consuming Aberration or Control Magic, and what it'll allow you to do is draw a card each turn from Damia and deal damage to each opponent. It's also going to have star equal to cards in your hand, so eventually it can get to be pretty insane, especially with Reliquary Tower out, so it's not just a 7/7. Even though it won't trigger from Damia because you actually skip your draw step, there's plenty of things to get around that in the deck, and that's why it's really good. Another example of something you want to bring back is Diluvium Primordial, just because it copies a spell from each player's graveyard. The best part about it is that you can get instants and sorceries back that affect you in a negative way, but hurt everyone else worse. It also has many positive effects. At the very worst, you're just getting ramp spells. At the best, you might be getting board wipes, which are bringing all of your things back and helping you essentially protect what you need to. An example of that is Snapcaster Mage. You're able to recast Damnation, or you're able to recast any of your instants or sorceries. They gain flashback until the end of the turn, and it only costs 2. It also has flash, so if you have an instant or a sorcery that's worth playing, it's always great to have. Next is Freakus Mender. It seems like an odd choice, but I have a lot of enchantments and creatures that I do want to survive. Again, the deck's not really complete, so it's probably just going to be swapped out straight through for an Eldrazi, but at the current standpoint, it's another body that ends up saving me either a Nether Void, or it can get me a Propaganda if I need it, or it'll return something troublesome like an Arayo. Arayo, even though it's an Italian, counters any spell that's cast the first time of each opponent's turn. It's a legendary essence that you flip after 4 spells have been cast, so it starts with a 1/1, which is really fragile, and you need to protect it. But in this deck, between all the storm counters that used to be in it, and between multiple players, it's not hard to achieve that in the EDH format. Now, there's also Worldspine Worm, which is just the quasi-Eldrazi I'm running. The fact that it dies and then puts 3 5/5s and then shuffles back is always great. Every time you shorten your library, you have a higher chance to cast it, and with all the ramp, you can usually get it on turn 6 or 7 if you really try. You can actually cheat it in earlier if you really want to get frisky with it, but it really just depends. Next is the Abyss. The Abyss was a lot stronger when they had the errata text that they had to sacrifice a creature, but it's still good. In this case, a opponent at their upkeep, and actually you as well, I should rephrase that. The new text for it on Oracle reads that each player, during his or her upkeep, sacks a creature, and then that was later changed to destroy, and from there, it cannot be regenerated. There's no way to get around the effect, so it's just a 4-mana instant speed removal spell every turn. Next, in terms of pesky enchantments, is Nether Void. Again, it's an Italian, so I apologize. Nether Void is really good in a ramp strategy because we'll always outrace people in mana unless they're playing mono green or they have a very weird deck. What it allows us to do is cancel everything, mana leak everything that's cast. So it does affect our spells, and it might seem like a big hindrance, but when people have to cast a Elvish Mystic for 4, or they have to cast a Boomerang for 5, it gets really nasty. Because a lot of times you're able to hold the one spell that you have as an answer, tap out, play it, and worry a lot less. There's a lot of tutors and things that you need in this deck because it functions on the element of modality and the allowance only of what you want on the board. And that's why it's really good. An example is Limdul's Vault. Life loss isn't always relevant in EDH. Sometimes it's very pesky. The best part about Limdul's Vault is that you essentially look through 5, and if you don't like it, you send it back. It goes to the bottom in any order, and then you pay 1 life, and you go through and find an additional 5. And you can find whatever answer you want, put it up top, and immediately draw it with a lot of Damia's effects. The fact that it's an instant is insane for this deck, because sometimes you end up paying 2 or 3 life to win the game. An additional tutor that's pretty good is Increasing Ambition. Originally, it was Diabolic Revelations, just so that I could pay X and with the ramp get as many spells as I needed, or as many cards as I needed. I ended up not having that anymore, so I am not running it. I'm shy of that one spell and a couple others that really matter. But it's still a great tutor. You can flash it back for 8, and then you end up getting 2 spells instead of 1. So for 1 card, you end up getting 3 from the deck, and it's something that helps filter through and get answers to anything you need. Green Sun Zenith is a little bit more conditional, but for the fact that it costs X and 1 green, it's still insane. You can end up getting something small late game, and that's the worst usually. But if you're going and paying 15 for an Eldrazi that comes in, you usually end up winning anyway. The fact that Green Sun is a green creature... Oh, excuse me. Actually, you can't get an Eldrazi. But the green creatures in it are still fine. I actually completely forgot about that. Green Sun's still a good target. Maybe I should read my cards. Next for the tutor is Liliana Vess. Liliana Vess is probably one of my favorite planeswalkers since she was made in Lorwyn. Her +1 doesn't really matter. It's just there so that you can protect her and activate her -2 as much as possible. Her -2 doesn't quite Demonic Tutor, but it puts it at the top. And with all the draws that you have, you really shouldn't miss that card. Shuffling again isn't always relevant, but sometimes it is, and it's a great way in order to move you forward in the game and get what you really need. Archmage Ascension is insane in this deck. If it's got enough counters, it'll trigger. Instead of drawing, you simply tutor, and then you put that into your hand. With Damia, you end up tutoring 3 to 4 times if you've cast spells, especially at instant speed. And if not, you're still tutoring for anything that you might need. The same is true for Vampiric. The fact that you just lose 2 at instant speed doesn't really matter because you just do it at the end of their turn. Demonic Tutor's a little bit less taxing, but it costs more. The fact that a sorcery is still fine, especially if you had Leyline of Anticipation in the deck. I don't because I actually couldn't find any, but it makes it insane. It's a 2 mana, search for whatever you want. The next tutor, and probably one of the weaker, is the Worldly Tutor, just for any kind of creatures. But it is instant, and you still get it. Even though you reveal what it is, and there's no element of surprise, there's a very small chance of it actually mattering, especially in Damia's colors. Tooth and Nail is always good. You can get whatever you need as an answer in terms of utilitarian creatures, or you can just drop whatever big creatures you might have in the deck. Now, in terms of having everything set, Court of Calling is probably the most expensive tutor, but it is an instant speed, and you get a creature. Paying X with the ramp is always great, because you can get whatever you might need and not have to worry about any kind of answers they might have. Now, there are a couple of just utilitarian cards in here. Probably the biggest is Sensei's Divining Top. The fact that you look at 3 and potentially draw is always fun with Damia, because you can rearrange the order to only draw the 1 or 2 that you need and ship the other back and then shuffle in a couple of instances. Now, the biggest example of utilitarian card is probably going to be Goryo's Demise. I had it as a replacement for something because I actually couldn't end up finding it. I still think it's great. It's destroy a legendary creature for 1 and 1 black against everyone's commander unless it has hexproof or shroud. It's a huge limit to what they can do. And the fact that you can either snapcast it back or, depending on the situation, cast it more than once means that you're able to completely lock people out of ever casting the commander again. And a lot of times the decks only function because of the commander, not in addition to the commander. A utilitarian card that I don't actually like, but enjoy running it in the current setup, is Aestheticism. Again, I apologize about the Japanese foil. It basically reads that all your creatures are Thrun. They can pay 1 green and 1 colorless, and they regenerate themselves, and they all have hexproof. Hexproof is nice because it means they can't kill your Prophet, they can't kill your Mimic that's cloning anything, and they can't kill your Metamorph until it becomes an artifact. Overall, it's a good card. I don't know if it fits right here, but it was something that I wanted to put in and try. The same is true of Propaganda. I think that there's enough answers that even if you paint yourself a target, it doesn't necessarily matter. I'm not sure if I can conclusively say that, but the fact that it's an additional tax in addition to Nether Void and Rhystic Study means that you're able to grief a lot of people with the deck. Dread Returned is always great. Early game, it's usually just going to get a ramper or something small, but late game you're returning something that does matter and ends up usually saving your life, or something that changes the board state as you know it. Boomerang's just a one-of. I don't know if I feel very strong about it, but I enjoy it so far. It just reads permanent. There's an edition that has Storm. It's Temporal Fishery, which I mentioned earlier. It's a little more awkward because it's a sorcery and it costs twice as much. It actually costs 5. But I think that Boomerang at instant speed is fine, even if it's double blue, and you probably won't cast it till turn 6 or 7. And next, just a card that usually wins games after you tutor for it, especially with Consuming Aberration unchecked, is Rise of the Dark Realms. The fact that you steal all creatures from all graveyards and put them back, including your own, means that you usually get the utility that you want from any of the creatures that are in the deck to begin with. You can then stack the triggers, and you usually get some pretty insane board states. And against people, if you had the Aberration out, it usually just means that they scoop or that they have to die the next turn. You have enough to defend yourself with, and unless somebody has Homeward Path, you usually get it off straight, and there's no answers. Even if they do, you can strip mine it, so there's not really a lot. It's not complete, but that's the Damia deck so far. I kind of want to put duels in, and I definitely want to put Eldrazi in. I'm just not sure what to take out at the moment, and I don't really want to buy $400 in cards for a casual deck. Either way, like, subscribe, thank you very much.